Taking a steadying breath, Penelope reminded herself of her purpose here, to observe, not participate. She had momentarily forgotten her place, and the result had been predictably mortifying. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. She avoided the main ballroom as much as possible, catching only glimpses of the Duke as he moved through the crowd, always surrounded by people eager for his attention. Once she thought she felt his gaze upon her, but when she looked in his direction, he was deep in conversation with an elegantly attired matron. It was nearing midnight when Mrs. Winters finally sought her out, flushed with wine and the excitement of having been included in conversations with ladies of rank. "There you are. I've been looking everywhere. Lady Pembroke has invited me to her card party next week," and she broke off, peering at Penelope's face. "Goodness, you look positively ill. I suppose it's for the best that we leave." "The carriage is waiting." As they made their way toward the entrance hall, a footman approached them, silver tray in hand. "Miss Fletcher." Surprised, Penelope nodded. "A note for you, miss." She accepted the folded paper with trembling fingers, aware of Mrs. Winter's curious gaze. The seal was unfamiliar, a simple W pressed into dark blue wax. "Well," Mrs. Winters demanded as they settled into the carriage, "who would be sending you notes at this hour?" Penelope broke the seal and unfolded the paper, her heart pounding. The message was brief, written in a bold, masculine hand. "Miss Fletcher, I find I have much more to say to you than our brief acquaintance allowed this evening. If you would permit me to call upon you tomorrow at 2 o'clock, I would be most gratified. Westmoreland." She stared at the note in disbelief, reading it twice more before looking up to find Mrs. Winters practically bursting with curiosity. "It's from the Duke of Westmoreland," Penelope said, her voice faint even to her own ears. "He wishes to call tomorrow." Mrs. Winters' eyes widened to the point of comedy. "The Duke of Westmoreland call on you?" She snatched the note from Penelope's unresisting fingers and read it herself, her expression shifting from disbelief to calculation in an instant. "Well, this is unexpected. What did you say to him? How did you manage this?" "I said very little, in truth. We danced once and exchanged perhaps a dozen sentences." "A dozen sentences," Mrs. Winters echoed, sounding dazed. "A dozen sentences, and the most eligible bachelor in England wishes to call. Perhaps there is more to you than meets the eye, Penelope Fletcher." As the carriage rattled through the rain-slick streets, Penelope gazed out at the blurred lights of London, her thoughts in turmoil. She could not fathom why the Duke would wish to see her again. Was it mere curiosity, some sort of jest at her expense, or could there be a more sinister motive? Whatever his reason, one thing was certain. Allowing James Fairchild, Duke of Westmoreland, into her life, even for the brief span of an afternoon call, would be dangerous indeed. For in the moment they had danced together, when his eyes had held hers with unexpected warmth, she had felt something stir within her that she had long thought dormant. Hope, and hope, for someone in her position, was the most dangerous emotion of all. The following morning dawned clear and bright, as if the previous day's rain had washed London clean. Penelope rose early, having slept little, and found Mrs. Winters already in the breakfast room, directing Milly in an unprecedented flurry of cleaning. "Ah, there you are," Mrs. Winters said, looking up from her list. "We've much to do before the Duke arrives. The drawing-room is positively shameful. All those books of your father's must be organized, and that shabby settee needs to be covered with something more presentable." "Mrs. Winters," Penelope began carefully, pouring herself a cup of tea, "I'm not entirely convinced that the Duke will actually call. Such notes are often written in the spirit of the moment and forgotten by morning." "Mrs. Winters fixed her with a sharp look. "Nonsense. A duke does not write such notes lightly, and if there is even the slightest chance that he will appear, we must be prepared." She tapped her list emphatically. "I've sent for fresh flowers, and cook is preparing her best seed cake. The good china must be brought out, and you, she paused, eyeing Penelope critically. "You must wear your green day dress. It brings some color to your complexion." "The green has a tear in the sleeve," Penelope pointed out, though she knew it was futile to resist. When Mrs. Winters set her mind to something, she was as immovable as the Thames. "Then mend it." "Honestly, Penelope, one would think you were determined to sabotage this opportunity." Opportunity. There was that word again, laden with expectations she could not possibly fulfill. But arguing would only prolong the discussion, so Penelope merely nodded and applied herself to her breakfast, her appetite diminished by the knot of anxiety in her stomach. The morning passed in a whirlwind of activity. The drawing-room was transformed from a comfortable, if somewhat shabby, space into a stiff approximation of a fashionable parlor. The books were arranged by size rather than subject, much to Penelope's dismay and Mrs. Winter's collection of porcelain figurines was prominently displayed on every available surface. At 1:30, Penelope retreated to her room to change. The green day dress, once mended, was indeed her most flattering garment, though it too was several seasons out of style. She arranged her hair simply but neatly, resisting Mrs. Winter's suggestion that she try a more elaborate style. "I would rather present myself as I am," she said firmly. "If the Duke has some genuine reason for calling, pretense will serve no purpose." Mrs. Winters sniffed disapprovingly but did not press the issue. At precisely 5 minutes before 2, they took their positions in the drawing-room, Mrs. Winters on the freshly covered settee, Penelope seated by the window with a book of poetry open on her lap, a picture of genteel composure that belied the rapid beating of her heart. The clock on the mantel had just struck 2 when there was a knock at the door. Penelope's fingers tightened on her book as they heard Millie's hurried footsteps in the hall, followed by a murmur of voices. Then the drawing-room door opened, and Millie announced with barely suppressed excitement, "His Grace, the Duke of Westmoreland." He stood framed in the doorway, even more imposing in daylight than he had appeared the previous evening. His tailored dark blue coat emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, his cravat was tied with elegant simplicity, and his top boots gleamed with polish. But it was his face that captured Penelope's attention, those changeable eyes that seemed to see more than others, the firm mouth that hinted at both authority and humor. Mrs. Winters practically leapt to her feet. "Your Grace, what an honor to receive you in our humble home. I am Mrs. Winters, Miss Fletcher's cousin and guardian." The Duke bowed slightly. "Mrs. Winters, thank you for receiving me on such short notice." His gaze moved to Penelope, who had risen more slowly. "Miss Fletcher." "Your Grace," she replied, cursing and hoping he did not notice the slight tremor in her voice. "Please do be seated," Mrs. Winters gushed, gesturing to the best chair, a wing-backed affair that had seen better days but was still the most impressive piece of furniture in the room. "Millie, bring the tea at once, and the seed cake. And those little almond biscuits." As Millie hurried out, Mrs. Winters launched into a stream of conversation, extolling the virtues of the neighborhood, the excellence of their local church, and the distinguished connections of her late husband's family. The Duke responded with impeccable courtesy, though Penelope noted a certain reserve in his manner. Finally, after what seemed an eternity of small talk, Mrs. Winters paused for breath, and the Duke seized the opportunity. "I hope you will forgive my presumption in calling, Miss Fletcher, but our conversation last evening was cut short, and I found myself with questions I wished to ask you." Penelope met his gaze directly. "What questions could you possibly have for me, Your Grace?" A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Direct, as you were last night, refreshing in a world of circumlocution." He accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Winters with a murmured thanks. "I understand you were formerly governess to Lady Hargrove's daughter." "Yes, for a brief period. Catherine is a delightful child with a quick mind." "And before that?" Penelope hesitated, uncomfortably aware of Mrs. Winters watching their exchange with avid interest. I taught the daughters of several families in our acquaintance. Nothing so grand as a permanent position in a noble household. Yet you are clearly educated beyond what is common. Your father was. A scholar, she replied, lifting her chin slightly. Dr. Henry Fletcher. He translated classical texts and wrote monographs on ancient philosophy. Not lucrative pursuits, but ones that brought him great satisfaction. The Duke nodded thoughtfully. I believe I may have read his translation of Seneca's letters. Excellent work with insightful commentary. Surprise and pleasure flickered through her. You've read my father's work. I have a modest library at Westmoreland House. Philosophy occupies a significant portion of the shelves. He set down his teacup. Miss Fletcher, I shall come to the point. I am in need of a governess for my ward, and I believe you may be ideally suited to the position. Of all the things Penelope had imagined the Duke might say, this had not even entered her consideration. Your ward, she repeated, too stunned to form a more coherent response. My niece, Lady Clara Fairchild, she is 12 years old, intelligent but somewhat spirited. Her previous governess resigned rather abruptly last month, citing an inability to manage the child's temperament. Mrs. Winters, who had been uncharacteristically silent, now leaned forward eagerly. A position at Westmoreland House. Penelope, what an extraordinary opportunity. But Penelope was studying the Duke's face, trying to discern his true purpose. Forgive me, Your Grace, but there must be dozens of qualified governesses in London with far more impressive credentials than mine. Why would you offer such a position to someone you barely know? He met her scrutiny without flinching. Because in our brief acquaintance, you demonstrated qualities I value: honesty, intelligence, and a refreshing lack of artifice. Lady Hargrove speaks highly of your teaching methods, and Clara needs someone who will see her as she is, not as her title dictates she should be. There was something in his tone that gave Penelope pause, a hint of concern beneath the matter-of-fact explanation. The child is troubled. Not troubled precisely, merely resistant to conventional expectations. Her mother, my sister, died when Clara was 8. Since then, she has been raised primarily by a succession of governesses, none of whom have managed to gain her trust. And you believe I might succeed where others have failed. The Duke's expression softened slightly. I believe you understand what it means to navigate a world where you do not quite fit the prescribed mold. The observation, so accurate and yet so unexpectedly perceptive, left Penelope momentarily speechless. She was saved from having to respond immediately by Mrs. Winters, who was practically vibrating with excitement. Penelope has a remarkable way with difficult children, she declared. Such patience, such firmness when needed. Why, Mrs. Beckworth's youngest was positively feral before Penelope took him in hand. Mrs. Winters exaggerates, Penelope said dryly. Thomas Beckworth was merely high-spirited and in need of intellectual stimulation. The Duke's lips quirked. Then perhaps you and Clara will suit admirably, as that description fits her precisely. He leaned forward slightly. The position offers a private suite of rooms, the use of an extensive library, and a salary of £70 per annum. You would have the freedom to develop a curriculum you deem appropriate, with the expectation that it includes the usual feminine accomplishments, as well as a solid foundation in literature, history, and languages. £70 per annum. It was a generous salary, far more than the typical rate for a governess. Penelope's mind raced. Such a position would free her from dependence on Mrs. Winters. It would provide security, intellectual stimulation, and purpose. And yet, may I inquire where your household is primarily based, Your Grace? Westmoreland House in London during the season, and Fairchild Hall in Derbyshire for the remainder of the year, with occasional visits to other properties as required. He studied her face. You have reservations. It was not a question, but Penelope answered nonetheless. I would be foolish not to consider carefully before accepting such a position. Teaching is a vocation I value, but becoming a governess in your household would place me in an unusual social position. His brow furrowed slightly. How so? She chose her words with care. Your Grace, we both know that our conversation last evening has already generated speculation. If I were to enter your household immediately thereafter, it might give rise to misconceptions. Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by something that might have been respect. You are concerned for your reputation. And yours, Your Grace. A duke's actions are subject to far more scrutiny than those of an obscure governess. Mrs. Winters looked between them in alarm. Surely such concerns are secondary to the opportunity being presented. Your Grace, I assure you, Penelope would be an exemplary governess. The matter of gossip is hardly. On the contrary, the Duke interrupted, his tone gentle but firm, Miss Fletcher's concern is entirely valid. I had not considered how the timing might appear. He turned his attention back to Penelope. Would it ease your mind if the position were to commence in, say, a fortnight? And perhaps with a formal letter of recommendation from Lady Hargrove to establish the professional nature of our connection. The fact that he understood her concerns so readily and offered a practical solution without dismissing her misgivings impressed Penelope deeply. That would be most appropriate, Your Grace. Excellent. Then shall we consider the matter provisionally settled, pending Lady Hargrove's letter and any further questions you may have about the specific duties involved. Penelope hesitated only briefly before nodding. Yes, I believe so. Wonderful, Mrs. Winters exclaimed. This calls for celebration. More tea, Your Grace. Another slice of cake. The Duke declined politely, rising to his feet. Thank you, but I have taken enough of your time. I have an appointment with my solicitor that I cannot miss. He turned to Penelope. Perhaps you would walk with me to the door, Miss Fletcher. I have a few additional details about Clara that might help you prepare. Understanding that he wished to speak with her privately, Penelope agreed, ignoring Mrs. Winter's look of disappointment. In the small entry hall, safely out of Mrs. Winter's earshot, the Duke paused. I feel I must apologize, Miss Fletcher. Apologize, Your Grace. I was not entirely forthcoming about my purpose in calling today. He looked uncharacteristically hesitant. The governess position is genuine, and I do believe you would excel in it. But I must confess that my primary motivation for seeking you out was rather more personal. Penelope's heartbeat quickened. I don't understand. Last night when we danced, I felt a connection that I have rarely experienced. Your honesty, your perspective on the theatrical performance of society, it was like a breath of fresh air in a stifling room. His eyes held hers intently. I wanted to know you better, but I realized that conventional social interactions would not permit that, given our respective positions. The governess position provides a respectable context for further acquaintance. For a moment, Penelope was too stunned to respond. The Duke of Westmoreland was admitting to a personal interest in her, plain, penniless, unremarkable Penelope Fletcher. It seemed utterly implausible. Your Grace, she said finally, her voice carefully controlled, I appreciate your candor, but I must be equally honest. If your offer of employment is merely a pretext for something else, then I cannot accept it. To her surprise, he did not seem offended by her bluntness. The position is genuine, and your qualifications are real. Clara does need a new governess, and I believe you would be excellent. But I would be lying if I said I did not hope that our professional association might allow us to develop a friendship beyond the constraints of ballroom conversations. Friendship, Penelope repeated, testing the word. Between a duke and his niece's governess. He smiled slightly. Improbable, perhaps, but not impossible. I find conventional social boundaries increasingly tiresome, particularly when they prevent meaningful connections. She should refuse. Every instinct for self-preservation told her to politely decline the position, to retreat to the safety of her unremarkable existence. The Duke of Westmoreland, with his wealth, his power, and his undeniable charisma, represented danger of the most insidious kind, the danger of hope, of possibility, of believing that the rigid boundaries of her world might somehow be more permeable than she had thought. "I am not naive, Your Grace," she said quietly. "I know what happens to women in my position who develop friendships with their employers. I value my integrity too highly to compromise it, no matter how gilded the cage might be." Instead of anger or dismissal, his expression reflected genuine respect. "Then we understand each other perfectly, Miss Fletcher. I assure you that my intentions are honorable. The position is offered on its merits, and any friendship that might develop would be conducted with absolute propriety." He paused. "I would never ask you to compromise your principles. Indeed, it is those very principles that I admire." Penelope studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. She found none, only a forthright intensity that was difficult to dismiss. "Very well," she said at last. "I accept the position as Clara's governess, with the understanding that it is a professional arrangement first and foremost. If a friendship develops naturally, so be it, but I will not hesitate to resign should I feel my position or reputation is being compromised." Relief and satisfaction crossed his features. "I would expect nothing less." He reached into his coat and withdrew a sealed letter, "the formal offer of employment, along with details of the position and your duties. I took the liberty of preparing it in advance, hoping you would accept." As she took the letter, their fingers brushed briefly, sending an unexpected warmth through her hand. Penelope stepped back quickly, disconcerted by her reaction. "I shall call again next week to finalize the arrangements," the Duke said, seemingly unaware of her momentary discomfort. "Until then, Miss Fletcher." He bowed and departed, leaving Penelope standing in the hallway, the letter in her hand feeling heavier than its physical weight would suggest. She had just agreed to enter the household of one of the most powerful men in England, a man who had openly admitted to a personal interest in her. It was either the most prudent decision she had ever made, offering financial independence and professional fulfillment, or the most reckless, exposing her to emotional complications she could ill afford. As she turned to face Mrs. Winter's inevitable barrage of questions, Penelope had an unsettling feeling that it might prove to be both. The fortnight that followed the Duke's visit passed in a blur of preparation and increasing anxiety. Lady Hargrove had indeed provided a glowing letter of recommendation, which had been delivered by a liveried footman, along with a note from the Duke confirming Penelope's start date and arranging for a carriage to collect her and her belongings. Mrs. Winters, after recovering from her initial shock at Penelope's imminent departure, had thrown herself into the task of ensuring her young cousin would be properly equipped for her new position. Penelope's meager wardrobe had been supplemented with 2 new day dresses of serviceable navy and grey, a warm cloak for the coming winter, and various small necessities that Mrs. Winters deemed essential for someone entering a ducal household. "You must remember that you will be representing not only yourself, but our family," she lectured, as she inspected Penelope's neatly packed trunk. "The Winters name may not be as illustrious as Fairchild, but we have our pride." Penelope refrained from pointing out that she was a Fletcher, not a Winters, and that Mrs. Winters had shown little enough family pride when relegating her to the smallest bedchamber and treating her as little better than an unpaid companion. Instead, she merely nodded and continued with her preparations. On her final night at Millington House, Penelope sat at the small desk in her bedchamber, writing in the journal that had been her confidant for years. The flame of her single candle cast wavering shadows across the page as she attempted to articulate her tumultuous thoughts. "Tomorrow I enter a new life," she wrote, "one that offers both opportunity and peril. I cannot deny that the Duke's interest in me, however he might describe it, is both flattering and frightening. No man has ever looked at me as he did, as though he saw something valuable beneath my unremarkable exterior. But I must be practical. Whatever his current fascination, it will inevitably fade when confronted with the reality of my position in his household. I shall be Clara's governess, nothing more, and that must be enough. She closed the journal and slipped it into her reticule, unwilling to pack it in the trunk that would be handled by servants. Some thoughts were too private to risk exposure. The following morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect autumn day. Penelope, dressed carefully in her best walking dress of dark green wool, her hair arranged simply but neatly beneath a modest bonnet. As promised, the Duke's carriage arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, a gleaming black vehicle with the Westmoreland crest emblazoned on the door, drawn by a matched pair of chestnuts that drew admiring glances from passers-by. Mrs. Winters, never one to miss an opportunity for neighborhood display, insisted on a prolonged farewell on the front steps, embracing Penelope with uncharacteristic warmth while ensuring that every neighbor who might be watching could see the ducal carriage at her door. "Write often," she instructed, though they both knew her interest in Penelope's welfare extended only so far as it might reflect favorably on herself. "And remember everything I've taught you about proper behavior." Penelope bit back a smile at this last admonition, considering that Mrs. Winter's own behavior often left much to be desired. "Thank you for your guidance, cousin, and for your hospitality these past years." With a final wave, she allowed the footman to hand her into the carriage, settling onto luxurious seats that made the hired hack they had taken to Lady Hargrove's ball seem like a farm cart by comparison. As they pulled away from Millington House, Penelope felt a curious mixture of trepidation and liberation. Whatever awaited her at Westmoreland House, it represented a new chapter in a life that had, until now, offered few surprises. The journey through London was brief but illuminating. As they moved from her modest neighborhood into the fashionable heart of Mayfair, Penelope observed the increasing grandeur of the houses, the better-dressed pedestrians, the general air of prosperity that permeated the streets. When the carriage finally turned into a wide, tree-lined drive and stopped before an imposing mansion of pale Portland stone, she had to remind herself to breathe. Westmoreland House was not merely grand, it was magnificent. 3 stories of classical elegance, with tall windows and a portico supported by Ionic columns, it dominated its corner of Mayfair with understated authority. Footmen in the Duke's livery stood at attention as the carriage door was opened, and a distinguished older man, clearly the butler, waited at the top of the steps to greet her. "Miss Fletcher," he bowed precisely, "I am Simmons. His Grace has asked me to welcome you and show you to your quarters. Your belongings will be brought up directly." Penelope followed him through a marble-floored entrance hall, past priceless artwork and antique furniture, up a sweeping staircase, and along several corridors. The opulence was overwhelming, from the silk-covered walls to the thick carpets that muffled their footsteps. Finally, Simmons paused before a polished oak door. "Your suite, Miss Fletcher. His Grace thought you might appreciate some time to settle in before meeting Lady Clara. Tea will be served in your sitting room at 4 o'clock, at which time Mrs. Grave, the housekeeper, will provide you with the household schedules and answer any questions you may have." With that, he opened the door and ushered her into a sitting room that was larger than the entire upper floor of Millington House. Sunlight streamed through tall windows that overlooked a private garden, illuminating comfortable furnishings in shades of blue and cream. A small writing desk stood in one corner, a bookshelf filled with volumes in another. 2 doors led off the main room. "The bedchamber and dressing room are through there," Simmons explained, gesturing to the left, "and that door connects to what will be Lady Clara's schoolroom. It has been prepared according to His Grace's instructions, but he mentioned that you should feel free to make any changes you deem appropriate for your teaching methods." Penelope nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. "His Grace is currently attending to business in the city, but expects to return for dinner. He has requested your company in the small dining room at 7 o'clock, if you are not too fatigued from your journey." This roused Penelope from her daze. "Dinner with the Duke?" "Yes, miss, and Lady Clara, of course. His Grace thought it would be a suitable introduction." Simmons's expression remained impassive, though Penelope thought she detected a hint of curiosity in his eyes. "Will there be anything else, miss?" "No, thank you. This is all. Most satisfactory." When Simmons had departed, Penelope moved slowly through the rooms, running her fingers over the fine furnishings, scarcely able to believe that this would be her home for the foreseeable future. The bedchamber contained a four-poster bed draped in blue silk, a dressing table with a silver-backed brush set, and a wardrobe that could have accommodated 10 times her modest collection of clothes. The dressing room beyond held a copper-hip bath and various toiletry items arranged on marble shelves. Returning to the sitting room, Penelope approached the door that led to the schoolroom. It opened into a large, airy space with 2 desks, one sized for a child, the other clearly intended for her use, a globe, a piano, and shelves stocked with books, maps, and educational materials. Like her own quarters, it was elegantly appointed but practical, designed for serious study rather than mere show. As she stood in the center of the room, trying to absorb the reality of her new situation, there was a soft knock at the outer door of her suite. Opening it, she found a young maid curtsying nervously. "Begging your pardon, miss. I'm Lily, assigned to be your personal maid. Your trunk has arrived, and I wondered if you'd like me to unpack for you." Personal maid. Of course, a governess in a ducal household would have a personal maid. Penelope managed a smile, though the notion seemed absurd to someone who had spent years caring for her own needs. "Thank you, Lily. That would be most helpful." As Lily efficiently unpacked her belongings, Penelope moved to the window, gazing out at the immaculate gardens below. The contrast between this luxury and her previous existence was so stark as to be almost unreal. Yet here she was, about to dine with a duke and assume responsibility for the education of his niece. And what of the duke himself? He had spoken of friendship, of a connection that transcended their respective social positions. In the pragmatic light of day, such notions seemed like fantasy. Yet the memory of his intense gaze, of the respect with which he had addressed her concerns, suggested he was not a man given to idle words. "Will there be anything else, miss?" Lily's voice interrupted her thoughts. Penelope turned from the window. "No, thank you, but perhaps you could tell me something about Lady Clara. I'm to meet her at dinner, and I'd like to be prepared." A flicker of something, caution, perhaps, crossed Lily's young face. "Lady Clara is spirited, miss, clever as anything, but not one to be told what to do. The last governess, Miss Pritchard, left after Lady Clara put a frog in her bed." Despite her nerves, Penelope found herself smiling. "I see, and has Lady Clara expressed any opinion about my arrival?" "Not to me, miss, but I heard from Jenny, who attends her, that she said she'd give this one a fortnight, same as the last." Lily looked alarmed, as though fearing she had said too much. "But I'm sure it will be different with you, miss." "Thank you for your candor, Lily. It's always helpful to know what one is facing." Penelope's mind was already calculating how best to approach a child who clearly viewed governesses as temporary inconveniences to be dispatched as quickly as possible. After Lily departed, Penelope spent the remainder of the afternoon familiarizing herself with the schoolroom materials and planning her initial approach to Clara's education. At 4 precisely, a knock announced the arrival of tea, along with Mrs. Grave, a formidable woman of about 60 whose crisp manner suggested she ran the household with military precision. "Miss Fletcher," she said, inclining her head slightly, "welcome to Westmoreland House. I trust your quarters are satisfactory." "More than satisfactory, Mrs. Grave. They're quite luxurious." A hint of approval crossed the housekeeper's features. "His Grace was most specific about your accommodations. He said you were to have the blue suite, which has not been used since the late Duchess was alive. It was her favorite for visiting ladies of quality. Penelope's eyebrows rose at this information. The late Duchess's favorite suite. For a governess, it seemed an unusually generous arrangement. Over tea, Mrs. Grave provided a detailed overview of the household schedules, when meals were served, which areas were accessible to the staff, the procedures for requesting supplies or assistance. Throughout the discussion, Penelope had the distinct impression that she was being evaluated, though for what purpose she could not tell. "And now, if you'll forgive my impertinence, Mrs. Grave said as she rose to leave, might I offer a word of advice?" "Of course." Lady Clara has had 5 governesses in 4 years. Each began with enthusiasm and ended in frustration. The child is not malicious, merely protective of her independence. His Grace has indulged her perhaps more than is wise, but he has his reasons. The housekeeper's expression softened slightly. "She needs stability, Miss Fletcher, and patience." Penelope nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Mrs. Grave. I'll bear that in mind." Left alone, Penelope turned her attention to preparing for dinner. Her limited wardrobe offered few options, but she selected her best evening dress, a simple gown of deep blue silk that had been her mother's and altered to fit her smaller frame. It was hardly fashionable, but it was well made and becoming to her coloring. As Lily helped her dress, securing the tiny buttons up the back and arranging her hair in a simple but elegant knot, Penelope attempted to quell her growing anxiety. Dining with the Duke and his niece on her first evening was a far more intimate introduction than she had anticipated. She had expected at least a day to acclimate to her new surroundings before facing her employer in a social setting. "You look lovely, miss," Lily said, stepping back to admire her work. "That blue brings out the gold in your eyes." Penelope smiled at the girl's kindness, though she harbored no illusions about her appearance. "Thank you, Lily. Now, how do I find the small dining room?" Armed with directions, she made her way through the mansion's corridors, trying not to gawk at the artwork and antiques that lined her path. At precisely 7 o'clock, she arrived at the designated room where Simmons stood waiting. "Miss Fletcher," he acknowledged, opening the door and announcing her with formal precision. The small dining room, which could easily have accommodated a dozen guests, was intimate only by comparison to what must be the main dining hall. A table of polished mahogany gleamed in the candlelight, set for 3 with fine china, crystal, and silver. Standing by the fireplace, the Duke turned at her entrance, his expression warming visibly. "Miss Fletcher, welcome to Westmoreland House." He crossed to greet her, taking her hand briefly. "I trust you found your accommodations comfortable." "Exceedingly so, Your Grace. Thank you for such generous quarters." He nodded, seeming pleased by her response. "And where is Clara?" He glanced toward the door with a slight frown. As if on cue, the door opened again, and a girl entered, tall for her age, with a cascade of dark curls barely contained by a ribbon and the same changeable eyes as her uncle. She wore a gown of pale yellow that should have been cheerful, but somehow conveyed reluctance in its slightly rumpled state. Her expression was one of studied indifference. "Ah, Clara," the Duke said, his tone warm but firm. "May I present Miss Fletcher, your new governess? Miss Fletcher, my niece, Lady Clara Fairchild." Penelope smiled, offering a slight curtsy that acknowledged the girl's rank without being obsequious. "Lady Clara. I'm very pleased to meet you." Clara's gaze swept over her with unconcealed assessment. Most governesses regret meeting me rather quickly." "Clara," the Duke admonished, though Penelope detected a hint of amusement in his tone. "It's quite all right, Your Grace," Penelope said calmly. "I appreciate honesty, even when delivered bluntly." She addressed Clara directly. "I understand you've had several governesses recently. That must be very disruptive to your studies." The girl shrugged, moving to take her place at the table as a footman held her chair. "Not particularly. They all teach the same tedious things in the same tedious way. Rather than responding immediately, Penelope waited until they were all seated and the first course, a delicate soup, had been served before continuing the conversation. "What subjects interest you most, Lady Clara?" "None that ladies are supposed to study," came the prompt reply. "I want to learn about astronomy and natural philosophy and mathematics." But Miss Pritchard said those weren't suitable for a young lady's education and tried to make me practice the pianoforte for hours instead. She glanced at her uncle. "That's why I put the frog in her bed." The Duke coughed slightly, and Penelope had the distinct impression he was suppressing a laugh. "While I don't condone such methods," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "perhaps Miss Fletcher will have a more accommodating view of your educational interests." Clara's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Do you know anything about astronomy, Miss Fletcher?" "I know that Jupiter has at least 4 moons, discovered by Galileo in 1610, and that the currently accepted model of our solar system places the sun at the center, not the Earth," Penelope replied. "My father had a keen interest in the subject and taught me what he knew, though I'm certain there is much more to learn." For the first time, genuine interest flickered in Clara's expression. "Your father taught you." "Most fathers don't bother educating their daughters beyond finding a husband." "My father believed that an active mind deserves cultivation, regardless of whether it belongs to a man or a woman." Penelope sipped her soup. "He was considered rather eccentric for his views." "I think I would have liked your father," Clara declared, with the directness of youth. "I think he would have liked you as well, especially your interest in subjects beyond the usual feminine accomplishments." Penelope glanced at the Duke, finding him watching their exchange with evident satisfaction. "Though I should note that there is value in those accomplishments too, when approached with the right attitude." Clara rolled her eyes, but her hostility had noticeably diminished. The remainder of the meal passed in relatively comfortable conversation, with Clara gradually revealing more about her interests and previous educational experiences. It became clear to Penelope that the girl was indeed highly intelligent, frustrated by the constraints placed on female education, and deeply suspicious of authority figures who might attempt to mold her into a conventional young lady. By the time the dessert course was served, a delicate apple tart with cinnamon, Penelope had formed a tentative plan for approaching Clara's education, one that would incorporate the subjects that genuinely interested her while still providing the foundation she would need to navigate society as she grew older. As they were finishing their dessert, the Duke addressed his niece. "Clara, would you mind if I speak privately with Miss Fletcher for a few moments? There are some administrative matters regarding her position that we need to discuss." The girl shrugged, though her expression suggested she suspected the conversation would be about her. "May I go to the library then? I was reading about Sir Isaac Newton yesterday." "Of course, but not too late, mind. Tomorrow you begin your lessons with Miss Fletcher." When Clara had left, the Duke rose and moved to a small sideboard, returning with 2 glasses of amber liquid. "Madeira," he explained, placing one before Penelope. "I thought you might appreciate something a bit stronger than tea after facing Clara's initial assessment." Penelope accepted the glass with a small smile. "She's exactly as Mrs. Grave described, not malicious, merely protective of her independence." "You handled her remarkably well," the Duke said, settling back in his chair. "Most governesses either attempt to establish immediate dominance, which Clara resists with every fiber of her being, or they surrender authority entirely in an attempt to win her affection. Neither approach would work with a child of her intelligence and spirit. She needs boundaries, certainly, but also respect for her interests and capabilities." Penelope sipped the Madeira, appreciating its rich sweetness. "If I may ask, Your Grace, what happened to Clara's parents?" A shadow crossed his face. "My sister, Elizabeth, died of fever 4 years ago. Clara's father, the Earl of Harrington, never recovered from the loss. He travels constantly, sending exotic gifts to Clara but rarely seeing her. He relinquished guardianship to me 2 years ago, claiming he couldn't bear to be reminded of Elizabeth every time he looked at their daughter. The pain in his voice was evident, though carefully controlled. Penelope felt a surge of compassion for both the Duke and Clara. "That explains much about her behavior," she said softly. "She's lost not one parent, but effectively both, and then faced a parade of temporary authority figures who ultimately left her as well." The Duke nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "You understand precisely. Clara doesn't form attachments easily because she expects everyone to leave eventually. It's why I've been so concerned about finding the right governess for her." He leaned forward slightly. "Miss Fletcher, I must ask you directly. Do you intend to remain in this position for the foreseeable future? Clara needs consistency above all else." Penelope met his gaze steadily. "Assuming that the arrangement proves satisfactory to all parties, yes, I do intend to remain. I have no family obligations that might call me away, no suitor waiting in the wings." She smiled wryly. "Stability is something I value highly myself, having had precious little of it these past few years." Relief crossed his features. "Good, very good." He hesitated, then added, "I should mention that we will be departing for Fairchild Hall in Derbyshire next week. The London season is effectively over, and Clara is always happier in the country. I trust that won't pose a problem." "Not at all, Your Grace. I was aware that your household divides its time between London and Derbyshire." "Excellent." He rose, indicating their conversation was drawing to a close. "I have some correspondence to attend to this evening, but perhaps you would join me for breakfast tomorrow. We can discuss Clara's education in more detail then." Penelope stood as well, smoothing her skirts. "Of course, Your Grace." He escorted her to the door, pausing before opening it. "I meant what I said earlier, Miss Fletcher. You handled Clara remarkably well. I believe you may be exactly what she needs." His words, spoken with evident sincerity, warmed her unexpectedly. "Thank you, Your Grace. I shall do my best not to disappoint your confidence." As she made her way back to her suite, Penelope reflected on the evening. Clara would be a challenge, certainly, but a rewarding one. The girl's intelligence and curiosity were evident, merely needing proper guidance to flourish. And the Duke himself had been everything that was proper and respectful, treating her with a consideration that went beyond mere employer to employee. Yet as she prepared for bed in her luxurious new quarters, Penelope could not shake a lingering sense of unease. The Duke of Westmoreland was not simply her employer. He was a man who had admitted to a personal interest in her, however he might frame it as friendship. And despite her determination to maintain appropriate boundaries, she could not deny that she found him increasingly fascinating. His evident care for his niece, his respect for Penelope's own concerns, his subtle humor that occasionally broke through his reserved exterior. "Remember your place," she murmured to herself as she extinguished the candle beside her bed. "Remember who you are and who he is." But as she drifted into sleep, Penelope wondered if the boundaries she had so carefully constructed around her heart would prove as vulnerable as Clara's defenses had been to genuine understanding and respect. The first week at Westmoreland House passed in a blur of activity as Penelope established a routine with Clara and prepared for their imminent departure to Derbyshire. To her surprise and relief, the girl had proven remarkably receptive to her teaching methods, particularly once Penelope had demonstrated her willingness to incorporate astronomy, natural philosophy, and mathematics into the curriculum. "Miss Pritchard said ladies have no need for algebra," Clara had declared on their second morning, eyeing the mathematical text Penelope had selected with suspicion. "Miss Pritchard was entitled to her opinion," Penelope had replied calmly, "just as I am entitled to mine. And I believe that a well-trained mind, regardless of whether it belongs to a lady or a gentleman, should be capable of logical reasoning and mathematical thinking." Clara had studied her for a long moment before nodding decisively. I think I shall give you a month before putting any frogs in your bed." It was as close to a declaration of acceptance as Penelope was likely to get, and she had concealed her amusement behind a serene smile. The Duke, true to his word, had met with her several times to discuss Clara's education, always maintaining a perfect balance of professional interest and personal courtesy. If she occasionally caught him watching her with an expression that suggested thoughts beyond their official relationship, he never acted upon them or made her uncomfortable. Indeed, his respect for her position only increased her own confusing attraction to him, an attraction she was determined to ignore. On the eve of their departure for Fairchild Hall, Penelope was summoned to the Duke's study after Clara had retired for the night. She found him seated behind a massive oak desk, surrounded by papers and ledgers. "Ah, Miss Fletcher," he said, rising as she entered. "Thank you for coming. Please be seated." He gestured to a comfortable chair opposite his desk. "You wish to see me, Your Grace?" Penelope settled into the chair, smoothing her skirts nervously. "Yes, regarding our journey tomorrow." He resumed his seat, his expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Grave informs me that Clara has requested to travel in the same carriage as you, rather than with her maid, as is customary." Penelope's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Indeed. I wasn't aware. It seems you've made quite an impression in a short time." His smile was warm with approval. "Clara rarely forms attachments so quickly." "I wouldn't call it an attachment just yet," Penelope cautioned. "Rather, I think she's found that I'm willing to discuss topics that interest her, which is a novelty." The Duke nodded. "Nevertheless, it's a promising development. I've approved the arrangement, of course. The journey to Derbyshire takes the better part of 2 days, with an overnight stay at an inn. You and Clara will travel in the second carriage, with her maid and your Lily. I'll be riding ahead with my steward to prepare for the household's arrival." "Very well, Your Grace." Penelope hesitated, then added, "May I ask what I should expect at Fairchild Hall?" "Is the household there significantly different from London? Less formal in some ways, more traditional in others?" He leaned back in his chair. "The hall has been the Fairchild family seat for over 300 years. It's larger than this house, set in extensive grounds with gardens, a lake, and woodland. The staff there have served my family for generations, and many are related to each other. They can be somewhat protective of their Duke and his niece." Penelope smiled at his rueful tone. "I imagine they'll view the new governess with a certain amount of suspicion, then." "Initially, perhaps. But they're fair-minded people who value competence and kindness. Show them both, and you'll win them over quickly enough." He paused, studying her face. "You seem apprehensive." "Not apprehensive, precisely. Just aware that I'll be establishing myself all over again in a new environment." The Duke's expression softened. "You've adapted admirably to Westmoreland House. I have every confidence you'll do the same at Fairchild Hall." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "I hope you'll find it a true home in time. Both you and Clara deserve that." The unexpected gentleness in his voice touched something deep within Penelope, a longing for home and belonging that she had suppressed for years. She looked down, momentarily unable to meet his gaze. "Thank you, Your Grace. That's a kind sentiment." When she glanced up again, she found him watching her with an intensity that sent warmth spreading through her chest. For a breathless moment, something unspoken passed between them, a connection that transcended their formal roles. Then, as if recalling himself, the Duke straightened in his chair. "There is one other matter I wish to discuss. Lady Rosemont has invited herself to Fairchild Hall for a fortnight's visit, beginning next week." The abrupt change of subject, and the mention of Lady Rosemont in particular, jolted Penelope back to reality. "I see. I doubt that you do, actually," he said, a hint of dry humor in his tone. "The countess and I have a complicated history. She was my sister's friend before Elizabeth's death, and she has positioned herself as a potential duchess ever since my period of mourning for my late wife ended 3 years ago. Penelope blinked, surprised by his frankness. I wasn't aware you had been married, Your Grace. Briefly, Anne died in childbirth, along with our son, after less than a year of marriage. His voice was carefully controlled, but Penelope could hear the old pain beneath the composure. It was nearly 7 years ago now. I'm very sorry, she said softly. He acknowledged her sympathy with a slight inclination of his head. Lady Rosemont has been particularly persistent in her attentions since our encounter at Lady Hargrove's ball. I believe she may have interpreted my interest in you as a challenge to her position. Penelope's stomach tightened. That would explain her less than warm greeting that evening. Indeed, I mention this not to alarm you, but to prepare you. The countess can be calculating when she perceives a threat to her ambitions. Surely she doesn't see me as a threat, Penelope said, genuinely bewildered. A governess has no place in the social calculations of someone like Lady Rosemont. The Duke's expression was unreadable. The Countess has a particular skill for sensing when her plans might be disrupted, regardless of the source. He sighed. I would have preferred to refuse her visit, but doing so would only fuel speculation and gossip. Better to receive her with courtesy and make it clear that her romantic aspirations are not reciprocated. Penelope nodded, though his explanation left her feeling uneasy. I shall endeavour to stay well out of her ladyship's way. That may be wise, though not always possible in a household, even one as large as Fairchild Hall. He rose, signalling the end of their meeting. The carriages will depart at 9 tomorrow morning. I'll see you briefly before I ride ahead. As Penelope returned to her quarters to complete her packing, she reflected on the Duke's warning about Lady Rosemont. It seemed absurd that a woman of the Countess's standing would view a governess as any sort of rival, yet the Duke had clearly believed it necessary to alert her to the possibility of unpleasantness. More troubling was her own reaction to the news that Lady Rosemont would be visiting Fairchild Hall. The twist of discomfort she had felt was dangerously close to jealousy, an emotion she had no right to experience regarding her employer's social connections. This is precisely what you feared, she murmured to herself as she folded a shawl into her trunk. Developing inappropriate feelings because he has shown you basic human kindness and respect. Yet even as she chided herself, Penelope could not forget the moment of connection they had shared, that brief interval when class and position had seemed to fall away, leaving only two people who recognized something in each other that defied conventional explanation. It was folly, of course. The Duke of Westmoreland might enjoy her conversation, might even harbor some genuine affection for her, but the gulf between them was unbridgeable. He was one of the most powerful men in England. She was a penniless governess, dependent on his goodwill for her livelihood. As she prepared for bed, Penelope resolved to focus entirely on Clara's education and her own professional duties once they reached Fairchild Hall. Whatever personal interest the Duke had expressed in friendship would inevitably wane when confronted with the realities of country life and the persistent attentions of women like Lady Rosemont, who actually belonged in his social sphere. It was better to accept that truth now than to nurture foolish hopes that could only end in disappointment. The journey to Derbyshire unfolded much as the Duke had outlined, with one significant difference: the weather. What had begun as a crisp autumn morning deteriorated rapidly into a blustery, rain-soaked afternoon that slowed their progress considerably. By the time they reached the coaching inn where they were to spend the night, the entire party was weary and damp despite the protection of the carriages. Clara, however, had remained in surprisingly good spirits throughout the journey, dividing her time between reading a volume on celestial navigation that Penelope had procured for her, and peppering her governess with questions about everything from the geological formations they passed to the migratory patterns of birds. I like traveling, she announced as they settled into their chamber at the inn, a cozy, if somewhat rustic room with two narrow beds. One sees so many interesting things. Uncle James promised that next summer we might tour the Lake District if my studies progress well. Penelope smiled as she helped Clara change into dry clothing. The Lake District is beautiful. My father took my mother and me there when I was about your age. I remember being entranced by the mountains reflected in the water. You've been many places, haven't you, Miss Fletcher? Clara asked, sitting on the edge of the bed while Penelope brushed out her tangled curls. Not as many as I would like, Penelope admitted. But my father believed in the educational value of observing the world firsthand, so he traveled when his work and finances permitted. Clara was quiet for a moment, submitting to the gentle strokes of the brush. My father travels all the time, but he never takes me with him. Uncle James says it's because he can't bear to be reminded of my mother, but I think it's because he simply doesn't want to be bothered with a child. The matter-of-fact tone broke Penelope's heart. I'm sure that's not true, Clara. Grief affects people in different ways. Some find comfort in reminders of their loved ones, others find it too painful. But it's been 4 years, Clara said, her voice small. Shouldn't he be better by now? Uncle James was sad when my mother died, and when Aunt Anne died before that, but he didn't run away to the other side of the world. Penelope set down the brush and moved to sit beside Clara on the bed. Your uncle is an exceptionally strong person from what I've observed. Not everyone has that same strength. The girl looked up at her with those unsettlingly perceptive eyes. Uncle James says you understand what it means to lose people you love. Surprised that the Duke had discussed her personal history with Clara, Penelope nodded slowly. I do. My mother died 4 years ago, like yours, and my father 2 years after that. Were you very sad? Yes, Penelope said simply. I still am, sometimes, but I also remember how they lived, not just how they died. That helps. Clara considered this. I don't remember much about my mother anymore, just that she smelled like roses and laughed a lot. Uncle James has portraits of her at Fairchild Hall. He says I look like her. Then I look forward to seeing those portraits. Penelope smiled. Now, shall we go down for supper? I believe your uncle may have arrived ahead of us if the weather didn't delay him too severely. Indeed, the Duke was waiting for them in the inn's private dining room, looking remarkably composed despite what must have been a wet and uncomfortable ride. He rose as they entered, his face lighting with evident pleasure. Clara, Miss Fletcher, I trust your journey was less disagreeable than mine. We stayed perfectly dry in the carriage, Clara informed him. And Miss Fletcher explained all about how mountains are formed by movements of the Earth's crust over millions of years. Did you know that the limestone in Derbyshire contains fossils of creatures that lived in ancient seas? Miss Fletcher promised we might look for some once we reach Fairchild Hall. The Duke's eyebrows rose as he held a chair for Penelope. Did she indeed? I didn't realize geology was among your scholarly interests, Miss Fletcher. My father had a collection of fossils, Penelope explained, taking her seat with a grateful smile. He believed that understanding the history written in stone gives one a proper perspective on human affairs. A wise man, your father. The Duke seated himself opposite her. Clara, did Miss Fletcher also mention that Fairchild Hall has its own small museum of natural history? My grandfather was something of an amateur scientist and collected specimens from all over the world. Clara's eyes widened. You never told me that. You never expressed an interest in natural history before, he replied, with a small smile for Penelope. Perhaps you might help Miss Fletcher catalogue the collection as part of your scientific education. The meal that followed was surprisingly pleasant, given their humble surroundings. The inn's fare was simple but well prepared, and the conversation flowed easily among the three of them. Clara, stimulated by the prospect of exploring the natural history collection, chattered enthusiastically about all she hoped to learn, while the Duke and Penelope exchanged amused glances at her exuberance. As Clara's eyelids began to droop with fatigue, the Duke suggested it was time for her to retire. "We have another long day of travel tomorrow, and the roads will be muddy after today's rain." "But I'm not tired," Clara protested, even as she stifled a yawn. "Of course not," he agreed solemnly. "Nevertheless, you should accompany Miss Fletcher upstairs and not be tired in the comfort of your bed." With a reluctant nod, Clara rose and curtsied to her uncle. "Good night, Uncle James." "Good night, my dear." He brushed a kiss against her forehead, a gesture of affection that clearly came naturally to them both. As Penelope made to follow Clara from the room, the Duke spoke again. "Miss Fletcher, might I have a brief word after you've settled Clara? I've had news from Fairchild Hall that might affect your arrangements." "Of course, Your Grace. I shall return directly." Once Clara was tucked into bed, already half asleep despite her protests, Penelope made her way back to the dining room. She found the Duke standing by the fire, a glass of what appeared to be brandy in his hand, his expression thoughtful. "Ah, Miss Fletcher, thank you for returning. Please sit." He gestured to a chair near the fire and took the one opposite. "Would you care for a glass of sherry? The inn's selection is limited, but not entirely uncivilized." "No, thank you, Your Grace." Penelope settled into the chair, acutely aware of the intimacy of their setting, the small room, the crackling fire, the late hour. "You mentioned news from Fairchild Hall." "Yes," he sipped his brandy before continuing. "It seems Lady Rosemont has arrived early, claiming she misunderstood the dates of her invitation. She is already installed at Fairchild Hall, awaiting our return." Penelope's heart sank. "I see." "I doubt her mistake was genuine," the Duke said dryly. "The Countess rarely does anything without calculation. By arriving early, she likely hopes to establish herself as hostess before we return." "That would be presumptuous." "Indeed, though Mrs. Wilson, our housekeeper at Fairchild Hall, is more than capable of thwarting such ambitions." A hint of humor touched his lips. "Mrs. Wilson has managed the household for 30 years and considers it her personal domain. Even I hesitate to contradict her on domestic matters." Penelope smiled, trying to ignore the knot of tension forming in her stomach at the thought of facing Lady Rosemont so soon. "She sounds formidable." "She is, but also fair and kind-hearted beneath her stern exterior. You'll like her, I think, and she'll appreciate your sensible approach to Clara's education." He paused, studying her face. "But that's not why I asked you to return. I wanted to assure you that Lady Rosemont's presence at Fairchild Hall changes nothing regarding your position or my support of your methods with Clara." Relief washed through Penelope. "Thank you, Your Grace. I appreciate your confidence." "You've earned it." His gaze held hers, warm with something that might have been more than mere approval. "Clara has shown more enthusiasm for learning in 1 week with you than in months with her previous governesses. Whatever your methods, they clearly resonate with her." "It's not so much method as recognition," Penelope said thoughtfully. "Clara is a child with extraordinary intelligence who has experienced profound loss. She needs to know that her mind is valued and her feelings are understood. Previous governesses may have focused too much on molding her into a conventional young lady without acknowledging the person she already is." The Duke nodded slowly. "That's precisely it. You see her, truly see her, as few adults in her life have bothered to do." He hesitated, then added, "just as you saw beyond the title and position when we first met." Penelope felt heat rise in her cheeks at the personal turn in the conversation. "I merely observed what was before me, Your Grace." "And that is a rare gift, Miss Fletcher." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. "Do you know what I saw when I first noticed you at Lady Hargrove's ball?" She shook her head, unable to look away from the intensity of his gaze. "I saw a woman who was present in a room full of people who were merely performing. Everyone else was playing a part. the ambitious mother, the coquettish debutante, the world-weary gentleman. But you were simply yourself, observing it all with those remarkable eyes that miss nothing. His voice had taken on a quality Penelope had never heard before, low and almost intimate. Your gown was simple, yes, but it was your authenticity that drew me to you. In a world of carefully constructed facades, you were refreshingly real. Penelope's breath caught in her throat. No one had ever spoken to her in such a manner, with such evident sincerity and admiration. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. "Your Grace," she began, uncertain how to respond. "James," he said quietly. "When we are speaking as friends, I would like you to call me James." The request hung between them, weighted with implications that Penelope scarcely dared consider. To address him by his given name would cross a boundary, small perhaps, but significant nonetheless. Yet the way he looked at her, as though she were someone of value beyond her role as Clara's governess, made her long to accept the gesture of intimacy he offered. "I don't think that would be appropriate," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Instead of offense, understanding filled his expression. "Because of our respective positions." "Yes." He nodded slowly. "You are right, of course. Propriety must be observed, particularly given your role in Clara's life." A hint of regret colored his tone. "But know this, Miss Fletcher, I meant every word. Your authenticity is a rare and precious quality, one I have come to value most highly." Before Penelope could respond, the door to the dining room opened, and the innkeeper entered to inquire if they required anything further for the evening. The moment of connection was broken, and the Duke rose to his feet with smooth composure. "Thank you, no. We'll be retiring now. Please ensure our carriages are ready by 8 tomorrow morning." As the innkeeper bowed and withdrew, the Duke turned back to Penelope. "I've kept you too long. You must be tired after the day's journey." "It has been a long day," she agreed, grateful for the return to safer conversational ground. He escorted her to the foot of the stairs, maintaining a proper distance. "Good night, Miss Fletcher. Rest well." "Good night, Your Grace." Penelope curtsied and ascended the stairs, feeling his gaze upon her until she reached the landing. In the darkened chamber she shared with Clara, Penelope undressed quietly, careful not to wake the sleeping child. As she slipped beneath the covers of her own narrow bed, her mind whirled with the implications of the Duke's words and the undeniable connection she had felt between them. He admired her authenticity, her realness. It was perhaps the most meaningful compliment she had ever received, valuing the very quality she had always considered a liability in a society that prized artifice and performance. Yet even as her heart warmed at the memory of his words, her mind cautioned restraint. The Duke might genuinely appreciate her straightforward nature, might even harbor warmer feelings than mere approval, but such sentiments rarely survived the practical realities of their disparate positions. At Fairchild Hall, surrounded by the trappings of his ancestral wealth and status, with Lady Rosemont in residence to remind everyone of the social order, whatever connection they had formed would inevitably fade. Better to focus on her duties to Clara, Penelope resolved as sleep began to claim her. That relationship was clear and defined, offering genuine fulfillment without the risk of heartache that would come from allowing herself to believe in possibilities that could never be. Yet as she drifted into dreams, it was the Duke's voice she heard, calling her refreshingly real, and his eyes she saw, warm with an admiration that made her feel, for perhaps the first time in her life, truly seen. Fairchild Hall emerged from the mist of a damp autumn afternoon like a vision from another age. As the carriage rounded the final bend in the long drive, Penelope caught her first glimpse of the ancestral home of the Dukes of Westmoreland, and despite her determination to maintain emotional distance, she could not suppress a gasp of wonder. The hall was magnificent, a harmonious blend of Elizabethan grandeur and later refinements, constructed of honey-colored stone that seemed to glow in the watery sunlight. Tall windows punctuated the symmetrical facade, which was centered on an imposing entrance with elaborate carvings above the door. Perfectly manicured gardens spread out on either side, giving way to parkland that extended as far as the eye could see, dotted with ancient oaks and sweeping vistas. "It's beautiful in summer," Clara said, observing Penelope's reaction with evident satisfaction, "when the roses are in bloom and you can swim in the lake. But I like it in autumn too, when the woods turn golden and there are mushrooms to collect." "It's beautiful in any season, I should think," Penelope replied, unable to tear her gaze from the hall as they approached. A welcoming committee had assembled on the steps, a double line of servants in the Duke's livery, headed by a tall, austere woman who could only be Mrs. Wilson, the housekeeper the Duke had mentioned. Standing apart from the staff, resplendent in a gown of deep crimson that highlighted her pale complexion and raven hair, was Lady Rosemont. Penelope felt her stomach tighten as the carriage drew to a halt. The Countess's presence was a stark reminder of the social gulf that separated her from the Duke's world, a gulf that their intimate conversation at the inn had momentarily made her forget. "Lady Rosemont is here," Clara noted, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I didn't know she was visiting. She always treats me like I'm 5 years old and pinches my cheeks." She made a face of profound disgust. "Your uncle mentioned that she had arrived earlier than expected," Penelope said carefully. "I'm sure he'll be pleased to see that she's being welcomed properly." Clara's snort of skepticism suggested she thought otherwise, but before she could comment further, the carriage door was opened, and a footman let down the steps. The Duke, who had arrived an hour ahead of them, appeared at the carriage door, offering his hand to assist them. "Welcome to Fairchild Hall, Miss Fletcher," he said formally, though his eyes conveyed a warmer greeting. "Clara, try not to race up the steps. You're a young lady, not a hoyden." Clara sighed dramatically, but complied with his request, descending from the carriage with relative decorum. Penelope followed, taking the Duke's offered hand briefly, acutely aware of Lady Rosemont's calculating gaze upon them. "Your Grace," the Countess called, gliding forward with a practiced smile. "How delightful to see you at last. I've been keeping your household entertained in your absence." "Lady Rosemont," the Duke replied, his tone perfectly courteous if somewhat cool. "You're earlier than expected." "A happy misunderstanding," she said with a light laugh. "It gave me time to become better acquainted with your charming staff. Mrs. Wilson has been most accommodating." The housekeeper's expression, visible over Lady Rosemont's shoulder, suggested that accommodating might not be the most accurate description of their interactions. "Clara, darling." The Countess turned her attention to the girl, bending to pinch her cheek exactly as Clara had predicted. "How you've grown. Soon you'll be ready for your coming out, and we'll have to find you a suitable match." "I'm 12, Lady Rosemont," Clara said flatly. "And I intend to become an astronomer, not a wife." The Countess laughed, as though Clara had said something delightfully precocious rather than delivered a serious statement of intent. "Such imagination. Just like your dear mother." Her gaze shifted to Penelope, sharpening noticeably. "And this must be the new governess I've heard so much about. Miss Fletcher, was it? How fortunate for you to secure such a position." The condescension in her tone was unmistakable. Penelope curtsied with perfect form, her expression serene despite the flush of humiliation threatening to rise in her cheeks. "Lady Rosemont, it's a pleasure to make your acquaintance again." Again, the Countess frowned slightly. "Have we met before?" "Briefly at Lady Hargrove's ball," Penelope reminded her, taking a certain satisfaction in the flicker of recognition and annoyance that crossed the other woman's features. "Ah, yes, the young woman in the interesting gown. How remarkable that you should now be Clara's governess. The world is full of surprising coincidences, isn't it?" Before Penelope could respond to this thinly veiled insinuation, the Duke intervened smoothly. "Perhaps we might continue this conversation inside. The afternoon grows chill, and I'm sure Miss Fletcher and Clara would appreciate refreshment after their journey. He offered his arm to Lady Rosemont with such practiced courtesy that even she could not object, though Penelope noted the slight tightening of the Countess's mouth at being diverted from her apparent intent to make Penelope uncomfortable. As they proceeded into the hall, Mrs. Wilson stepped forward to greet Penelope and Clara. "Welcome to Fairchild Hall, Miss Fletcher. I'm Mrs. Wilson, the housekeeper. His Grace has informed me of your position and requirements. Your rooms have been prepared according to his specifications." Her tone was formal, but not unfriendly. "Lady Clara, it's good to have you home. Cook has made those cinnamon biscuits you're fond of for tea." Clara's face lit up. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. May Miss Fletcher and I have tea in the small parlor? I want to show her the view of the lake." The housekeeper glanced at the Duke, who nodded his approval. "Certainly, Lady Clara. I'll have it served there directly." She turned back to Penelope. "Would you like to see your rooms first, Miss Fletcher?" "Yes, thank you. I'd like to freshen up before tea, if that's possible." As they followed Mrs. Wilson through the grand entrance hall and up a sweeping staircase, Penelope was aware of the Duke and Lady Rosemont watching their departure. She did not look back, though she felt the Countess's gaze like a physical touch between her shoulder blades. The interior of Fairchild Hall was as impressive as its exterior. Panelled walls adorned with family portraits, marble floors covered with priceless oriental carpets, furnishings that spanned centuries of craftsmanship, yet somehow formed a cohesive whole. It spoke of generations of wealth and taste, of a family firmly rooted in history and tradition. Mrs. Wilson led them along a corridor on the second floor, stopping before a door of polished oak. "These are your rooms, Miss Fletcher. Lady Clara's suite is adjacent, connected through the schoolroom, as in London." Penelope's quarters at Fairchild Hall proved to be even more spacious and elegant than those at Westmoreland House. A sitting room with tall windows overlooking the lake led to a bedchamber furnished with a canopied bed and antique dressing table. Beyond, that was a dressing room complete with a copper-hip bath and various amenities. "His Grace was most particular about your accommodations, Mrs. Wilson explained as she showed Penelope through the rooms. These were the Duchess's rooms for visiting ladies of quality, as at Westmoreland House, not the usual governess quarters, which are on the upper floor with the other senior staff. There was a question in the housekeeper's statement, though it was carefully phrased. Penelope met her gaze directly. "His Grace has been most generous in his arrangements for my comfort. I believe he feels it will benefit Lady Clara to have her governess nearby, given her history of unsettled nights." Mrs. Wilson's expression softened slightly. "Yes, the poor child has had her share of bad dreams since her mother passed. It's thoughtful of His Grace to consider that." "He seems to consider everything where Clara's welfare is concerned," Penelope observed. "Indeed, His Grace has always put family above all else." Mrs. Wilson hesitated, then added, "Lady Clara has had 5 governesses in 4 years. None lasted more than 6 months. His Grace hopes you'll prove more enduring." "So do I, Mrs. Wilson," Penelope smiled. "Clara is a remarkable child who deserves consistency and understanding." The housekeeper nodded approvingly. "I'm glad to hear you say so, miss. Too many have tried to force her into a mold that doesn't fit, if you'll pardon my saying so." "I quite agree. Clara's intelligence and curiosity should be nurtured, not suppressed." For the first time, a genuine smile touched Mrs. Wilson's stern features. "I believe you and I will get along very well, Miss Fletcher. Now, shall I show you to the small parlor? Lady Clara will be waiting." As Penelope followed Mrs. Wilson to where Clara had gone ahead, she reflected on the housekeeper's words. It was clear that the staff at Fairchild Hall were devoted to the Duke and his niece, protective of their welfare in a way that went beyond mere employment. It spoke well of the Duke's character that he inspired such loyalty in those who served him. The small parlor proved to be a charming room with large windows overlooking the lake, furnished with comfortable chairs and a round table already set for tea. Clara was standing at the window, her face pressed against the glass as she gazed out at the misty landscape. "The swans are back," she announced as Penelope entered. "There are 7 of them this year. Uncle James says they return to the same lake every autumn." "They mate for life, I believe," Penelope said, moving to join her at the window. "It's rare in the animal kingdom, but swans are remarkably faithful creatures." Clara considered this, like people are supposed to be when they marry, till death do us part. Yes, though people sometimes find that more difficult than swans seem to. The girl was quiet for a moment, watching the graceful birds glide across the still water. "My father didn't find it difficult, I mean. He loved my mother so much that when she died, he couldn't bear to stay where she had been. That's what Uncle James says." Penelope placed a gentle hand on Clara's shoulder. "Your uncle is a wise man, and your father's reaction, while painful for you, comes from a place of deep love." "I suppose." Clara turned from the window as a maid entered with the tea tray. "Oh, good. Cook did make the cinnamon biscuits. You'll love these, Miss Fletcher. They're the best in all of England, I'm certain of it." The tea that followed was a pleasant interlude, with Clara chattering about all the things she wanted to show Penelope around the estate. The natural history collection her uncle had mentioned, the library with its thousands of volumes, the stables where her pony was kept, the woods where they might hunt for fossils and mushrooms. "And the observatory," she exclaimed, reaching for another biscuit. "I forgot to tell you about the observatory. Grandfather had it built on top of the east wing. It has a telescope and everything. Uncle James says we can use it if the weather is clear." Penelope's interest was genuinely piqued. An observatory, that's extraordinary for a private home. Grandfather was interested in astronomy. Uncle James says I inherited my scientific curiosity from him. Clara beamed with pride at this connection to her ancestry. "We could go there tonight if the clouds clear. The moon is nearly full." "Perhaps tomorrow, Clara. We've had a long journey and you need a good night's rest." "But—" "Your governess is right, Clara." The Duke's voice came from the doorway, where he stood observing them with a small smile. "The observatory will still be there tomorrow, and the day after that." Clara sighed dramatically, but did not protest further. "Will you join us for tea, Uncle James?" "Thank you, but I've just come to inform Miss Fletcher that dinner will be at 8 this evening. Nothing formal, as we've only just arrived, but Lady Rosemont has expressed a desire for us all to dine together." Penelope's heart sank. She had hoped for at least one evening of peace before facing the Countess across a dinner table. "All of us, Your Grace." "You, me, Clara, and Lady Rosemont," he confirmed, his expression giving nothing away. "Clara usually dines with me when we're at Fairchild Hall, except on formal occasions, and as her governess, you should be present." Clara wrinkled her nose. "Must Lady Rosemont be there? She always talks about boring things like who's marrying whom in London, and she treats me like a baby." "Clara," the Duke admonished gently, "Lady Rosemont is our guest. We will extend her every courtesy, regardless of our personal feelings." The girl subsided with a mumbled acknowledgement, though her expression remained mutinous. The Duke turned his attention to Penelope. "I trust your quarters are satisfactory, Miss Fletcher." "More than satisfactory, Your Grace. They're quite luxurious." "Good." His gaze lingered on her face a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "I'll see you both at dinner, then." After he had gone, Clara looked at Penelope speculatively. "Uncle James gave you the blue suite, didn't he? The one that used to be for special visitors." "Yes," Penelope admitted, somewhat surprised by Clara's awareness of the household arrangements. "Mrs. Wilson mentioned that it's not the usual governess accommodation." "It's not. Miss Pritchard and all the others stayed in the upper floor, near the ladies' maids." Clara nibbled thoughtfully on a biscuit. "Uncle James must like you very much." Penelope busied herself with pouring more tea, hoping Clara wouldn't notice the flush rising in her cheeks. "I'm sure His Grace simply thought it would be more convenient for me to be near your rooms, given my responsibilities." Clara's skeptical expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by this explanation, but to Penelope's relief, she didn't pursue the subject further. Instead, she launched into a detailed description of the natural history collection they would explore the following day, her enthusiasm effectively diverting the conversation to safer ground. As they finished their tea, Penelope glanced out at the lake, where the swans continued their stately progress across the water, oblivious to human complications. Faithful for life, she had told Clara. There was something both beautiful and terrible about such constancy, about a bond so deep that its severance could leave one unable to remain in places that held memories of shared joy. She thought of the Duke, who had lost both a sister and a wife he loved, yet had somehow found the strength to remain present for Clara, to create a home where the child could feel secure despite her losses. It spoke of a character far deeper than his title or wealth might suggest, and it made the growing attraction she felt for him all the more dangerous to her peace of mind. Dinner that evening proved to be every bit as uncomfortable as Penelope had anticipated. Though the Duke had described it as nothing formal, the small dining room at Fairchild Hall was still a study in elegance, with fine china, crystal and silver, fresh flowers, and the soft glow of candlelight creating an atmosphere of intimate luxury. Lady Rosemont, clearly determined to establish her social dominance, had dressed with careful splendor in a gown of emerald silk that emphasized her statuesque figure and drew attention to the impressive emeralds at her throat and ears. Seated at the Duke's right hand, she commanded the conversation with practiced ease, regaling them with gossip from London society and reminiscences of shared acquaintances that pointedly excluded Penelope. "Do you remember Lady Harrington's musical evening last season, James?" she asked, using the Duke's given name with deliberate familiarity. "When poor Lord Pembroke fell asleep during his own daughter's pianoforte performance. Such a scandal." The Duke's smile was polite but restrained. "I believe I was in Derbyshire at the time, Serena. Clara had taken ill, if you recall." "Oh yes, of course." Lady Rosemont waved a dismissive hand. "Such a devoted uncle you are. It's really quite remarkable, considering your many responsibilities." Her gaze slid to Clara, who was pushing food around her plate with obvious boredom. "Though I imagine Miss Fletcher now relieves you of some of that burden." "Miss Fletcher has certainly made a positive difference in Clara's life," the Duke agreed, glancing at Penelope with a warmth that did not go unnoticed by the Countess. "Her approach to education is refreshingly practical and engaging." Penelope, seated across from Lady Rosemont with Clara beside her, murmured a thank you, conscious of the Countess's narrowing eyes. "How fascinating," Lady Rosemont said, her tone suggesting she found it anything but. "And what qualifications do you bring to this practical approach, Miss Fletcher? Were you educated at a particular institution?" The question was clearly designed to highlight what the Countess presumed would be Penelope's lack of formal credentials. Penelope took a small sip of wine before responding, determined to maintain her composure. "My education was primarily directed by my father, who was a scholar of some repute. Dr. Henry Fletcher," she added, seeing no reason to conceal her family connections. "He believed in a classical education, combined with practical observation and independent thought." The Duke nodded approvingly. Dr. Fletcher's translation of Seneca is considered definitive in certain circles. "I have several of his works in the library here." Lady Rosemont's eyebrows rose fractionally. "How? Unusual for a woman to be educated by her father rather than at a proper ladies' seminary." "Miss Fletcher's father sounds infinitely more interesting than any ladies' seminary," Clara interjected, unable to remain silent any longer. "He taught her about fossils and astronomy and algebra, much more useful than needlepaint and watercolors. Clara, the Duke said, his tone gently admonishing though his eyes reflected amusement. Well, it's true, Clara muttered, subsiding slightly. Young ladies must learn the social graces, Clara dear, Lady Rosemont said with saccharine sweetness. When you make your debut, you'll be expected to converse pleasantly, dance gracefully, and display proper feminine accomplishments. Not discuss fossils. She pronounced the word as though it were slightly obscene. Fortunately, Clara has several years before her debut, the Duke observed dryly. Ample time to acquire both intellectual knowledge and social graces. Miss Fletcher, I believe, is well qualified to guide her in both areas. Penelope inclined her head in acknowledgement of the compliment. Balance is essential in education. One need not sacrifice intellectual development for social accomplishments, or vice versa. Indeed, Lady Rosemont said, her smile not reaching her eyes. Though in my experience, gentlemen prefer a wife whose conversation doesn't overtax their understanding. Don't you agree, James? The Duke set down his wine glass with deliberate care. On the contrary, Serena. I find intelligent conversation to be one of life's great pleasures, regardless of whether it comes from a man or a woman. His gaze met Penelope's briefly. In fact, I have often thought that the practice of limiting women's education to superficial accomplishments does a disservice to society as a whole. A faint flush appeared on Lady Rosemont's cheeks, either from the implied criticism or the wine she had been consuming rather liberally throughout the meal. How progressive of you, James, though I wonder if your view is shared by the majority of your peers. Whether it is or not seems irrelevant, he replied. One's principles should not be determined by popular opinion. Clara, who had been following this exchange with evident interest, looked at Penelope with new respect. Uncle James always says that one must think for oneself, not follow the herd like sheep. A wise philosophy, Penelope agreed, smiling at the girl. Your uncle sets an excellent example in that regard. Lady Rosemont, apparently deciding that this line of conversation was not serving her purposes, abruptly changed the subject. James, I was thinking that tomorrow we might ride out to the North Woods. The autumn colors are at their peak, and you once mentioned that it's your favorite view on the estate. The Duke hesitated, glancing at Clara and Penelope. I had planned to show Miss Fletcher the natural history collection tomorrow morning. Clara is eager to begin cataloguing it as part of her studies. Oh, but surely that can wait a day or two, the Countess protested with a practiced pout. I'm only here for a fortnight, after all, and the weather may not remain so favorable. Perhaps we could visit the collection in the afternoon, Penelope suggested, unwilling to be the cause of discord despite her personal feelings about Lady Rosemont. Clara and I have plenty of other activities planned for the morning. Clara opened her mouth, clearly about to object, but a warning glance from Penelope silenced her. The Duke looked between them thoughtfully. That seems a reasonable compromise. Thank you, Miss Fletcher. He turned to Lady Rosemont. Very well, Serena. We can ride out tomorrow morning, provided the weather cooperates. The Countess's triumphant smile made it clear she considered this a victory. Excellent. I've brought my new habit from London, Madame de Lacroix's latest design. I think you'll find it quite fetching. The remainder of the meal passed in similarly strained conversation, with Lady Rosemont making frequent references to her long acquaintance with the Duke and their shared history, while Penelope focused on engaging Clara in discussion about their educational plans for the coming weeks. The Duke, she noted, seemed increasingly distant as the evening progressed, responding to Lady Rosemont's overtures with polite but minimal replies. When dinner concluded, Clara was sent to bed despite her protests that she wasn't tired, and the Duke suggested they retire to the drawing room for coffee. Penelope, sensing that Lady Rosemont was eager to have the Duke to herself, made her excuses. If you'll forgive me, Your Grace, Lady Rosemont, I should review my lesson plans for tomorrow. Clara is particularly interested in beginning our cataloguing project, and I want to ensure I've prepared appropriately. Lady Rosemont's relief was barely disguised. How conscientious of you, Miss Fletcher. Don't let us keep you from your duties. The Duke's expression, however, suggested he was less pleased with her departure. Are you certain, Miss Fletcher? There's an excellent collection of star charts in the drawing room that might interest you, given Clara's enthusiasm for astronomy. Penelope appreciated his attempt to include her, but remained firm. Another time, perhaps, Your Grace. Thank you for a lovely dinner. As she curtsied and departed, she was acutely aware of Lady Rosemont immediately moving closer to the Duke, her hand coming to rest on his arm with proprietary familiarity. The sight sent an unwelcome pang through Penelope's chest, a sensation she refused to acknowledge as jealousy. Back in her rooms, she changed into a comfortable dressing gown with Lily's assistance, then settled at the small writing desk to actually work on the lesson plans she had mentioned. It was better, she told herself, to focus on her professional responsibilities rather than dwell on the image of the Duke and Lady Rosemont together in the drawing room. She had been working for perhaps an hour when a soft knock sounded at her door. Assuming it was Lily returning to see if she needed anything before bed, Penelope called, "Come in." To her shock, it was the Duke himself who entered, still formally dressed though he had removed his dinner jacket. "Your Grace," she rose quickly, self-consciously aware of her informal attire and loose hair. "Is something wrong? Is Clara?" "Clara is fine," he assured her, remaining near the door. "I apologize for the intrusion and the late hour. I wanted to ensure you weren't too discomforted by Lady Rosemont's behavior at dinner." Penelope blinked in surprise. Of all the reasons she might have imagined for his visit, concern for her feelings had not been among them. "I'm quite all right, Your Grace. Lady Rosemont was, exactly as you had prepared me to expect." A rueful smile touched his lips. She was rather more obvious in her territorial display than usual. "I believe your presence unsettles her." "So it would seem, though I can't imagine why." A governess hardly poses a threat to a countess. The Duke's expression grew serious. "You underestimate yourself, Miss Fletcher, and you underestimate my regard for qualities that have nothing to do with titles or social position." The directness of his statement left Penelope momentarily speechless. When she found her voice, it was less steady than she would have liked. "Your Grace, that is, I appreciate your concern, but it's late, and this is improper," he supplied, making no move to come closer. "Yes, I suppose it is. I should not be in your private chambers at this hour, regardless of my intentions." He sighed. Another of society's arbitrary rules that seems designed to prevent meaningful conversation between people who might actually have something worthwhile to say to each other. Despite her discomfort, Penelope couldn't help but smile at his frustrated tone. "The rules do serve a purpose, Your Grace. They protect reputations, maintain order. And sometimes they prevent honesty and connection," he countered. "But you're right, of course. I'll take my leave." He paused at the door. "I meant what I said at dinner, about intelligent conversation being one of life's great pleasures. Yours, in particular, has become something I look forward to with uncommon anticipation." Before she could formulate a response, he was gone, closing the door softly behind him. Penelope sank back into her chair, her heart racing with a complicated mixture of emotions: pleasure at his words, anxiety about his increasingly personal attention, concern about Lady Rosemont's obvious hostility, and an undeniable longing for something she dared not even name to herself. This situation was rapidly becoming more complex than she had anticipated. The Duke's interest in her, whatever its nature, was becoming too obvious to ignore or dismiss as mere friendliness. And her own feelings, try as she might to suppress them, were deepening in ways that could only lead to heartache. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would establish clearer boundaries. She would focus entirely on Clara's education, maintain a proper distance from the Duke, and avoid Lady Rosemont as much as possible. Her position as governess was too important to jeopardize with inappropriate emotional entanglements. Yet as she prepared for bed, Penelope could not help but recall the warmth in the Duke's eyes when he had spoken of his regard for her, or the sincere concern he had shown for her feelings. Such genuine interest from a man of his position and character was as rare as it was dangerous to her peace of mind. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of swans gliding across a misty lake, faithful for life to their chosen partners, heedless of the human world and its complicated rules of propriety and position. The following week at Fairchild Hall fell into a pattern that both soothed and disturbed Penelope's equilibrium. Her days were structured around Clara's education, which proved even more rewarding in the country setting than it had been in London. The natural history collection, housed in a dedicated wing of the hall, provided endless opportunities for practical instruction in biology, geology, and taxonomy. The extensive library offered resources for literature, history, and languages. And true to Clara's excited description, the small observatory atop the east wing became a favorite evening destination whenever the skies were clear. Clara thrived under this regime, her natural intelligence blossoming when presented with meaningful challenges rather than rote memorization or endless repetition of conventional accomplishments. She still had moments of stubbornness or defiance, particularly when tired or frustrated, but these decreased as she came to trust that Penelope would not force her into activities she truly detested. "Miss Pritchard made me practice scales for 2 hours every day," she confided as they examined specimens in the natural history room. "Even though I told her I have no talent for music, she said a lady must play the pianoforte regardless of ability." "Music is valuable," Penelope acknowledged, "but not everyone has the same gifts. Your mind is clearly more suited to scientific inquiry than musical performance. We'll continue with basic music lessons for cultural understanding, but I see no reason to torture you or potential listeners with extensive practice." Clara's grateful smile had been reward enough for this departure from conventional education. The Duke, for his part, seemed pleased with Clara's progress and Penelope's methods. He made a point of reviewing their work regularly, sometimes joining them for lessons when his schedule permitted. These moments were both precious and painful for Penelope. Precious, because she genuinely enjoyed his insightful contributions and evident care for Clara's development. Painful, because each interaction strengthened the inappropriate attraction she felt toward him. Lady Rosemont, meanwhile, had established herself as an almost constant presence in the Duke's daily routine. She accompanied him on morning rides, solicited his opinion on her needlework in the afternoons, and dominated conversation at meals with references to their shared past and mutual acquaintances. Her behavior toward Penelope remained superficially polite, but laced with subtle condescension and occasional barbed comments disguised as innocent observations. "How devoted you are to Clara's education, Miss Fletcher," she remarked one evening at dinner. "Though one wonders if such unconventional methods will serve her well in society. After all, gentlemen are seldom impressed by a lady's knowledge of fossils or mathematics." "Perhaps not," Penelope had replied evenly, "but Clara will have the satisfaction of understanding the world around her, which seems a worthwhile goal regardless of its effect on gentlemen's impressions." The Duke had suppressed a smile at this exchange, while Clara had been less discreet, grinning openly at Penelope's response. It was clear to everyone in the household that Lady Rosemont viewed Penelope as a rival of sorts, though the notion seemed absurd given their respective positions. The servants, who had initially regarded Penelope with the cautious assessment reserved for newcomers, gradually warmed to her as they observed her genuine care for Clara and her respectful treatment of the staff. Mrs. Wilson, in particular, had become almost protective of her, often intervening to shield her from the worst of Lady Rosemont's manipulations. Her ladyship has requested that you and Lady Clara take your meals in the schoolroom this evening, the housekeeper informed Penelope one afternoon. She claims it would be more convenient for Lady Clara's studies. Penelope understood the real motivation perfectly well. Lady Rosemont wanted to dine alone with the Duke. If His Grace approves, we are happy to accommodate Lady Rosemont's suggestion. Mrs. Wilson's lips thinned. His Grace has not been consulted. The Countess took it upon herself to inform the kitchen directly. She lowered her voice slightly. I thought you should be aware before making any arrangements. Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. I appreciate your discretion. As it happened, the Duke had overruled Lady Rosemont's attempt to exclude Penelope and Clara from dinner, insisting that they maintain their usual family routine. The Countess had been forced to concede, though her expression had promised retribution at some future date. It was during the second week of Lady Rosemont's visit that matters came to a head. The autumn weather had turned unseasonably mild, prompting the Duke to suggest a picnic by the lake. Clara had been enthusiastic, especially when he mentioned that they might take out the small rowboat kept at the lakeside. You'll come too, won't you, Miss Fletcher? Clara had asked, her expression making it clear that the outing would be significantly less enjoyable without her governess's presence. Before Penelope could respond, Lady Rosemont had interjected smoothly. Oh, but Miss Fletcher must have duties to attend to. Lesson plans to prepare, books to review. We shouldn't distract her from her responsibilities, should we, James? The Duke had looked at Penelope, his expression making it clear that the choice was hers. Miss Fletcher is welcome to join us if her schedule permits. Put in such a position, Penelope had little choice but to agree, though she harbored significant reservations about spending an entire afternoon in Lady Rosemont's company. The day of the picnic dawned clear and warm, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of autumn leaves and wood smoke. The kitchen had prepared an elaborate basket of cold meats, cheeses, fruit, and pastries, along with a bottle of wine for the adults and lemonade for Clara. Rugs and cushions were loaded into a small cart, along with fishing rods at Clara's insistence, and the party set out for the lake shortly after noon. Lady Rosemont had dressed for the occasion in a walking dress of deep russet silk that complemented her dark coloring, with a matching parasol to shield her complexion from the sun. Penelope, by contrast, wore a simple gown of grey muslin with a light shawl against the occasional breeze. Clara, freed from the constraints of formal attire, was in her element in a practical dress that allowed her to explore the shoreline for interesting stones and plants. The lake itself was a picturesque setting, surrounded by trees in the full glory of their autumn foliage, gold, crimson, and bronze reflected in the still water. A small wooden dock extended into the lake, where the rowboat was tethered, gently bobbing with the minor movements of the water. It's perfect, Clara declared, as the servants spread rugs under a large oak tree near the shore. Can we go out in the boat first, Uncle James, before we eat? The Duke smiled at her enthusiasm. Perhaps just a short excursion. The boat only holds 3 comfortably, so we'll need to take turns. Lady Rosemont immediately stepped forward. I would love to see the lake from the water. The view must be enchanting. Then you shall go first, with Clara and me, the Duke said smoothly. Miss Fletcher can join us for the second outing. Though disappointed, Clara did not protest, and soon the 3 of them were settled in the boat, the Duke rowing with practiced ease, while Clara trailed her hand in the water and Lady Rosemont sat regally beneath her parasol. Penelope watched from shore, admiring despite herself the picture they made, the handsome Duke, the beautiful Countess, the bright-eyed child between them. They looked like a family, she thought with a pang that she immediately suppressed. A proper family of the same social rank, with shared experiences and connections that she could never hope to match. After about 20 minutes, the boat returned to the dock. Clara leaped out with typical exuberance, barely waiting for the Duke to secure the vessel. Miss Fletcher, it's your turn now. There's a family of ducks on the far side that you must see. And we saw a fish jump, this big. She stretched her hands wide to indicate a size that Penelope suspected was greatly exaggerated. Lady Rosemont exited the boat with the Duke's assistance, her hand lingering on his arm longer than necessary. Such a charming experience, James, though I confess the sun is rather intense on the water. I think I'll rest in the shade while you take Miss Fletcher out. If the Duke recognized this as the manipulative tactic, it was, leaving him effectively chaperoned by Clara rather than an adult who might observe his interaction with Penelope. He gave no sign. He simply helped Penelope into the boat, his hand warm and strong around hers, then settled Clara between them before pushing off from the dock. Out on the water, with a gentle breeze cooling her face and Clara's excited commentary providing a constant soundtrack, Penelope felt a rare moment of perfect contentment. The Duke rowed with easy, powerful strokes, guiding them toward the center of the lake, where the view of Fairchild Hall was particularly impressive. "It's beautiful from this angle," Penelope said, gazing at the honey-colored stone gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Like something from a fairy tale." "That's what my mother used to say," the Duke replied, his expression softening with memory. "She loved this view. When my father was alive, they would often come out here in the evenings, just the two of them." "Were they happy together?" Clara asked, displaying her usual directness. "Very happy," the Duke confirmed. "Theirs was a love match, unusual for their generation and station. My father was supposed to marry a duke's daughter, but he fell in love with my mother, the daughter of a mere baronet, and refused all other matches." "Was there a scandal?" Clara's eyes were wide with interest. The Duke chuckled. "A minor one. My grandfather was furious at first, but my mother won him over eventually. She had a way of making people see beyond their prejudices." His gaze met Penelope's briefly, and she felt an unexpected connection in that moment, a shared understanding of what it meant to be judged by arbitrary standards rather than personal qualities. "Look," Clara suddenly exclaimed, pointing toward the shore. "There's the Swan family." Indeed, the 7 swans Clara had noticed upon their arrival at Fairchild Hall were gliding serenely along the shoreline, their white plumage gleaming in the sunlight. The Duke guided the boat closer, though not so near as to disturb the birds. "The large one at the front is the cob, the male," he explained to Clara. "The pen, the female, is just behind him, and those 5 are this year's cygnets, nearly grown now." Clara watched them with fascination. "Miss Fletcher says swans mate for life. Is that true, Uncle James?" "It is indeed. Once a pair bonds, they remain together until one of them dies." "Like you and Aunt Anne would have," Clara said softly, "if she hadn't died." A shadow crossed the Duke's face, quickly controlled. "Yes, like that. And now Lady Rosemont wants to be your new swan," Clara continued, with the devastating innocence of childhood. "That's why she's always touching your arm and laughing at things that aren't even funny." Penelope felt heat rush to her face, mortified by Clara's observation despite its accuracy. "Clara, that's not an appropriate subject for discussion." The Duke, however, did not seem offended. "Lady Rosemont and I are old friends, Clara. She was your mother's friend too, remember." "That doesn't mean you have to marry her," Clara persisted. "I don't think you even like her very much. You get that little wrinkle between your eyebrows when she talks, the same one you get when Mr. Simmons tells you about problems with the estate accounts." Despite her embarrassment, Penelope couldn't suppress a small smile at this astute observation. The Duke caught her expression and raised an eyebrow in mock severity. "I see I'm surrounded by uncommonly perceptive females. A man can have no secrets in such company." "Do you want to marry Lady Rosemont, Uncle James?" Clara asked, clearly determined to get a direct answer. For a moment the Duke was silent, his gaze moving from Clara to Penelope and then out across the lake. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured. "Marriage is a serious commitment, Clara, not to be entered into lightly. If I were to marry again, it would need to be with someone for whom I felt deep respect and genuine affection. Someone who would be a positive influence in your life, as well as a companion to me. He looked directly at Penelope as he added, someone who sees beyond titles and wealth to the person beneath. The implication in his words and gaze was unmistakable. Penelope felt her heart beat faster, even as her mind warned her not to read too much into a statement that could be interpreted in multiple ways. Clara, however, had no such reservations. "You mean someone like Miss Fletcher?" The silence that followed this declaration was profound. The Duke's hands stilled on the oars, his expression unreadable. Penelope focused intently on straightening her shawl, unable to meet his eyes. "Clara," he said finally, his tone gentle but firm, "such direct comments can place adults in awkward positions. Miss Fletcher is your governess, and it is not appropriate to speculate about her personal life or mine in such a manner." "But—" "No buts. Now shall we return to shore? I believe luncheon should be ready by now, and you must be hungry after all this fresh air." As they rowed back toward the dock, Penelope kept her gaze fixed on the approaching shoreline, where she could see Lady Rosemont watching their return with evident impatience. The comfortable atmosphere of their outing had been shattered by Clara's innocent observation, replaced by a tension that seemed to vibrate between her and the Duke like a plucked string. Lady Rosemont must have sensed this tension as they disembarked, for her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You were gone quite some time. Did you circumnavigate the entire lake?" "We saw the swans," Clara announced, apparently unaware of the undercurrents swirling around her. "And we talked about who Uncle James might marry someday." Lady Rosemont's expression froze, then rearranged itself into a brittle smile. "Did you, indeed? How fascinating." The Duke intervened smoothly. "Clara has a lively imagination and a tendency to speak without considering the implications of her words. A quality we are working to refine, aren't we, Clara?" The girl had the grace to look somewhat abashed. "Yes, Uncle James." "Well, this all sounds perfectly charming," Lady Rosemont said, her tone suggesting it was anything but. "Shall we take luncheon now? I find myself quite famished after our exertions." The picnic that followed was a study in carefully maintained civility overlaying significant tension. Lady Rosemont positioned herself directly beside the Duke, effectively separating him from Penelope, who found herself seated at the far edge of the rug with Clara. The Countess dominated the conversation with anecdotes about mutual acquaintances and reminiscences of previous visits to Fairchild Hall, all designed to emphasize her long-standing connection to the Duke and his family. Penelope contributed little, focusing instead on ensuring that Clara ate properly and didn't fidget excessively. She was acutely aware of the Duke watching her when Lady Rosemont's attention was elsewhere, his expression thoughtful and somewhat troubled. After the meal, Clara begged to be allowed to fish from the dock, a request the Duke granted with the provision that she remain in full view at all times. This left the three adults in an uncomfortable grouping beneath the oak tree. "Miss Fletcher," Lady Rosemont said suddenly, breaking a silence that had stretched a bit too long, "I've been meaning to ask you about your previous employment. Were you a governess before coming to Westmoreland House?" "I taught the children of several families in my neighborhood," Penelope replied carefully, "though not in a formal governess position." "How interesting! And how did you come to His Grace's attention? It seems a rather fortuitous appointment for someone with limited experience." The implication was clear, and Penelope felt heat rise in her cheeks, partly from embarrassment and partly from anger at the thinly veiled insinuation. "I was fortunate enough to be recommended by Lady Hargrove, whose daughter I had taught briefly," she said, keeping her voice steady despite her discomfort. "Her ladyship was kind enough to speak well of my methods." "Ah, yes, through Lady Hargrove's ball, wasn't it?" Lady Rosemont's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Where you and His Grace had such a memorable first meeting." The Duke, who had been observing this exchange with increasing displeasure, finally intervened. "Lady Rosemont, I believe Clara could use some guidance with her fishing technique. Would you mind assisting her for a few minutes? I need to speak with Miss Fletcher about Clara's curriculum." Though clearly reluctant, Lady Rosemont could hardly refuse such a direct request. She rose with carefully concealed annoyance. "Of course, James, though I confess I know little about fishing. Clara will be delighted to instruct you," he assured her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "She considers herself quite the expert." Once Lady Rosemont was out of earshot, moving toward the dock with visible reluctance, the Duke turned to Penelope with an expression of genuine regret. "I apologize for Serena's behavior. Her questions were inappropriate, and her insinuations unworthy of a lady of her standing." Penelope smoothed her skirts, avoiding his gaze. "There is no need for apology, Your Grace. Lady Rosemont is merely protecting what she considers her territory. It's a natural instinct." "Her territory," he repeated, his tone somewhere between amusement and irritation. "I wasn't aware that I had been claimed as anyone's property." "Perhaps territory was the wrong word," Penelope conceded, "but it's clear that Lady Rosemont has certain expectations regarding your relationship." "Expectations I have never encouraged," the Duke said firmly. "Whatever, sir."